All right, you guys, welcome back. Last time we read, Bud has to drive back to town an hour and a half with Hermione Calloway. And this is really the first time that they've been left alone together. And when they get in the car, Bud finds out that Hermione Calloway has some of the same rocks that he has in his suitcase. And so he tells him right at the end, where we left off last time, that he has some of these same rocks. And all Hermione Calloway does was, So we're going to see how this conversation continues at the top of page 209. Really? I've got some too. He looked at me, shifted his pipe away from the talking side of his mouth and said, Bud, I know you're not the sharpest knife in the drawer, and I hate to be the bearer of bad tidings, but those are found all over the world. In fact, they're about as common as rocks. I almost didn't answer him, but since I didn't want to look so stupid, I said, Yes, sir, but mine have writing and numbers on them too. He said, We kept driving. Finally, I said to him, You don't believe me? I'll show you. I dropped his 3 rocks back into the glove box and closed it, then climbed over to the front seat to get at my sax case. I found it and set it on the back seat and unlocked it. As soon as I opened the top, that smell of old spit and crumpling up velvet and mildew came rushing out. It was still great. I lifted the little door that covered my rocks and took 2 of them out. I climbed back over the front seat, but kept the rocks covered in my hand. If he was going to see these, he was going to have to ask first. I crossed my arms across my chest and waited. It's a good thing I've got lots of patience, because I waited a long, long time. When we finally got back to Grand Calloway Station, Mr. Jimmy helped us unload the car. Finally, I decided that Mr. C had waited long enough. I stuck my rocks in his face and said, See, I told you turn the page, had some rocks like those. The only difference is mine say Flint M.8.11.11 and Gary IN.6.13.12. He said, Where did you find these? Didn't I tell you not to do any rummaging around in that room you've been sleeping in? He reached for the rocks. I don't know why, but I let him take them. He was the first person other than Bugs that I'd ever let touch the rocks that my mama had given to me. Mr. C turned the rocks over and over in his hands and said, Well, where did you get these? Uh-oh. I could tell by the way Hermione Calloway was holding my rocks that he didn't plan on giving them back to me anytime soon. I kept watching his hand, waiting for a chance to snatch my rocks and get out of there. If I could get my hands on my rocks, I knew I could outrun Mr. C, even though he was a lot stronger and his legs were a lot longer than mine. Hermione Calloway said, Answer me! Where did you take these from? Mr. C sounded meaner than he had ever had before. Mr. Jimmy heard him and put down the box he was carrying and walked over to us real quick. Hermione Calloway had the rock squeezed tight in his right hand fist and had his left hand fist balled up like he was ready to fight. Mr. Jimmy said, Herman, what's this? What's wrong? He stood between me and Mr. C. Hermione Calloway said, I told you about this boy from the word go. He's been snooping around things in the house, and he's got no business being in. He stole these. I said, No, sir, I did not. Mr. C said, Then where'd you get them? I'm not going to ask you again. He unsqueezed the rocks in his hand. I was surprised they hadn't turned into diamonds or dust the way he'd been holding them so tight. Mr. Jimmy took my 2 rocks from him. He looked at the writing and said, Flint, Michigan, August 18th, 1911. And Gary, Indiana, July 13th, 1912. That's more than 25 years ago. He squatted down and looked right at me and said, Son, where'd you find these? Just tell the truth. I kept one eye on Mr. C. He still looked like he was getting ready to jump funny on me. I said, Mr. Jimmy, I didn't find them or steal them from nowhere. These have always been mine. I got them from my mama, and that's a swear-for-God truth. Now could I please have my rocks back, sir? I stuck my hand out. Both Mr. Jimmy and Hermione Calloway said, Your mama? Yes, sir. I kept my hand out. Page 212. Mr. Jimmy said, Bud, where did your mother get these? I said, I don't know, sir. She always had them. Mr. Jimmy and Hermione Calloway were looking at me with that can't decide which hand to smack you with look, when Mr. Jimmy said, Bud, what did you say your mama's name was? No one ever asked me, sir. Hermione Calloway was still hot. You throw a lot of sirs around, but you've still got a real strong, real smart-mouthed, disrespectful streak in you, boy. Now you answer the question or I screamed at him. Angela, sir! I was so mad that I hadn't meant to say sir, but it came out anyway. Her name is Angela Janet Caldwell. Mr. Jimmy said, Lord, have mercy. Hermione Calloway's pipe dropped out of his mouth, and he stumbled and fumbled into Grand Calloway Station, feeling his way like he'd been struck blind. Then I knew Herman E. Calloway was the best liar in the world. He'd been lying to me and everyone else all along. Now that there was some good proof against him, he was all shook up. I said to Mr. Jimmy, I knew it! I knew he was my father! Mr. Jimmy was still crouched right down in front of me. He said, Bud, he's not your father. Page 213. Yes, sir, he is. That's why he run off like that. He got caught lying after all these years. Mr. Jimmy said, Bud, that's enough. Herman is not your father. But Angela Janet is his daughter's name. If what you're saying is true, Lord help us all, it looks like Herman might be your grandfather. This was real surprising, but the thing I felt most was glad that Herman E. Calloway wasn't my dad. Shucks, who'd want a daddy that on top of being so old and so doggone mean, had such a big belly? Not me.